Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel, and you may notice I'm in a slightly different location. I'm currently dog sitting this little guy here who is having a little nap, and we'll probably try and move and come and say hi during the process of this video, but there we go. But anyway, here is me talking about some of the books that I've read this week, and now I almost am going to feel a bit guilty because every time I need to put a picture of a book here, it's going to block lovely little Chilli. I'll try and see if I can avoid it where possible. But yeah, here are the books that I've read this week. And there's a little bit of a theme in some ways that many of the books I've read this week have been quite gritty in many ways. There are a couple of funnier ones in there to kind of balance it out a little bit. But the first one is no exception on the kind of grittiness side, and that is Show Me the Bodies by Peter Apps. And as the title suggests, not the most pleasant read at times, but really essential and critical one. So essentially for those of you outside of the UK and or those who might not have necessarily heard about it, a few years back there was a disaster where a tower block in London called Grenfell Tower caught fire, and essentially the fire spread incredibly quickly because of kind of building materials, because of various safety precautions that weren't really followed through properly, because of various parts of the cladding, so many factors that went into it. And this book is a really detailed exploration of how we got to this point and the sort of human tragedies that happened as a result. So this book is incredibly angry and pointed, and it has every right to be so. It's an incredibly brilliantly done book, I think, just in terms of the research, because we learn a lot about the human cost of what happened there and how so many people came to lose their lives. We learn about how various policies made it happen or made it worse. So, for example, policies that meant that the fire brigade acted in a certain way, policies that meant that the building had been built in a certain way, all of those sorts of things that all factor into what made the disaster what it was. And it's difficult reading in many ways, partly because you can't help but feel that so much of this was avoidable, that some policy changes, some additional investment, all of those things could have made this a very different story. Equally, there's a real fear that we haven't actually learned too many lessons from something like Grenfell, and that a lot of it could happen again. And the book closes in a very poignant way with the names of all of the people who lost their lives during it. And it's difficult reading as a book, but I really think is important for many reasons, and I would really highly recommend you checking it out if it sounds like something that you can stomach, because I think it's a really important book in many ways. Next up, I read Oxblood by, sorry, I won't block you for too long there, Chilli. Oxblood by Tom Benn, and this is a book that is really, I'll just move this over here, that is fascinating for so many reasons. It's, oh no, okay, bye-bye, Chilli. All right, there we go. It's, oh no, we're coming out. Hey, we could, this is just gonna be us watching the dog. We okay there? Yeah, okay, he's just, and apparently too close to snacks. Let's see if I can do the rest. Oh no, he's just fallen asleep again there. Okay, cool. Tom Benn with Oxblood. And so this is a book that looks at the story of a family growing up in Wythenshawe, which has sort of been sort of absorbed into Manchester, or sort of the general Manchester, the wider Manchester region. And the really interesting thing with this book is the way that it kind of investigates this family, and particularly it's quite unsparing. There's a note at the beginning of the book from the author that sort of says, actually, look, I know that some characters won't come across particularly well from this. I know that some of the things they say will sound awful, but that's the point. I'm not shielding anybody here, and I'm not kind of pretending everything was better than it was. And so we've got the sort of sets of working class families around the area kind of just trying to navigate various things, and often that can look like real solidarity and community. Often that can also just look like people tearing each other down, these sort of difficult relationships as people try to find a way of kind of propelling themselves or surviving in that landscape. And so, for example, one plot line is a young girl who starts basically dating or seeing her teacher, which is obviously many lines being crossed there. But it's interesting to sort of see how she, the young girl in that, articulates it, because she often sees it as sort of it being a sense of security and something that it's giving her, but there's also a sense of power that can come from having a secret on somebody. And so this book is really unflinching in how it deals with a lot of things. I think I did kind of need to let it sit a bit in my head after I finished reading it, because it's a lot, but equally has some real moments of tenderness and beauty that I think were really quite stunning. Next, on a lighter note in some ways, Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This is a book that I think had so much buzz around it, and so I was really excited to finally read it. And I read it as an audio as well, which was quite an interesting experience, because I think there's something about the way this book, the central character's way of approaching things that actually works really well with a narrator who can really capture the kind of obliviousness of it all. So essentially we have a writer at the heart of this book, who is our sort of narrator and kind of takes us through things. And she is incredibly oblivious in many, many ways, but essentially the key turning point in a lot of her friendships and relationships and the whole story really is a woman who she is incredibly, well, she likes to think she's good friends with, whilst also acknowledging that she's really not. She's a famous author. This friend is this famous author who's been doing really well and has been really kind of almost has everything that she wants, right? You know, she's been writing these books that become incredibly popular. She's prettier, she's richer, she is slightly more stable, she's more beloved, all of these things. And that kind of, from our narrator's point of view, seems to kind of carry with it a lot of bitterness. But the way that she approaches this kind of thing around Athena Lu, this magical woman, at first seems to be just sort of kind of hanging out with her still, and it almost feels a bit like, you know, she's hurting herself by doing so. The thing that then happens is Athena Lu dies, and in the whole sort of process of events, our narrator realizes that she has the opportunity basically to get this manuscript of a book by Athena Lu, which she then publishes, and she writes it, sort of rewrites it, and then publishes it under her own name. And in her mind, she sees some of the issues with this, but also basically says, well, you know, I wrote every word on that page. I wrote it, it's mine. And the obliviousness that comes with that is so fascinating. I think that's what really elevates this book, is it has sort of quite a lot of thrillery moments that I think are quite fun and quite interesting, and really kept me captivated throughout. But I think it does so much more in the way it investigates that by having this central narrator be incredibly oblivious to so many aspects of her own behavior. So she is a white woman, the woman whose book she's stolen, Athena Lu, is an Asian woman, and she doesn't necessarily see any of the issues with not only having stolen her work, but also stealing a work that is so distinctly about the Chinese American experience. And she is she doesn't really see any conflicts there. And when she's called out for it, she often thinks in her head, well, actually that passage was written by a Chinese woman. And so there's this interesting thing going on where when she's criticized for the work, well, that was Athena Lu, she wrote that, and so I can't feel bad. And when things are celebrated, she's like, well, yes, I wrote every single word, this is mine. And so she doesn't really quite seem to get it. What increasingly happens is that her life is sort of propelled through these very strange things. She's got this book that suddenly is selling incredibly well, but she is perceived as potentially being Asian American herself, partly because she has changed her name to have the surname Song. And by having that, people kind of read into that there's something's happening. So what happens really is this book then turns into this much wider discussion and critique around the publishing industry, of, you know, the way that some authors and books are kind of catapulted to the top of bestseller charts through marketing that makes them seem like the next best thing. But equally within that process, people can be torn down incredibly quickly online, or it kind of obfuscates some of the wider problems going on. And so this book, I think, functions so interestingly as this really interesting critique of the publishing industry, written by somebody who is a published author and therefore knows aspects of the publishing industry, but equally is just this very good, like, gutsy thriller that I really just enjoyed. So I think this book does so much and is really clever in its own way, and was a really delightful little surprise, I think, as well. Next up, I read Big Swiss by Jen Beagin, and this is a wild book in many, many ways. So the core idea of this is that we have, at the heart of it, our main character who works as a transcriber. And Greta is her name, but this sort of suddenly becomes sort of full of these other ethical issues, essentially. So she is listening into these transcripts and is transcribing them, and makes from that kind of builds up this picture of this woman in her head who she nicknames Big Swiss. And when at one point she's walking her dog, and she suddenly realizes that the person who she meets at the dog park is Big Swiss. They enter into some kind of affair sort of style thing, but obviously this is an incredibly complicated thing in terms of the ethics around it. Well, I say complicated, it's ethically wrong. It's not particularly complex in that sense. But this transcriber is now pretending to be somebody else, is pretending to be Rebecca, also a transcriber, but knows all these intimate details about Big Swiss's life. And she enters into this sort of relationship affair thing with Big Swiss never really knowing what's going on there. And it just kind of becomes more and more absurd as this relationship goes on. There are all these detailed descriptions of all the kind of things that they know about each other, well, that Rebecca / Greta knows about Big Swiss that she shouldn't. Just hello, sorry, just you right there, Chilli? He's come and joined me. And in the meanwhile, actually, Chilli very appropriately is a reminder, there are lots of dogs in this book, and a big part of how they meet is they are at the dog park together. There are all these other sort of side stories involving dogs at one point. But essentially the story is told in this really interesting narrative way, because essentially the book starts with us seeing the transcriber parts, and so the book is almost split into these. There you go, Chilli. It's split into these three sections almost, because we have three voices, because we have the three people speaking, and kind of in concert with each other, right? The therapist, there we go, the therapist and and Big Swiss talking, and our transcriber Greta responding often to what's happening. And so sometimes this means that, for example, Greta and Big Swiss go on a date, and Greta can then see how the date went through the transcript of the therapy session. So she's listening in as Big Swiss is saying, well, actually, I think she spoke too much, and I think she says everything as soon as it enters her mind. And it's just this fascinating way of the narrative kind of unfolding. It's a really absurd book. It kind of has that very sarcastic, dry, absurd, very online, almost humor that reminded me a little bit of someone like Patricia Lockwood in a really good sense, of that very that's such a sardonic kind of way. Some absolutely absurd phrases in this book, but I thought it was just such an interesting way of telling a story. It gets a little bit sort of, it goes into a little bit of a wild romp kind of in the latter half of this book that sometimes for me was incredibly successful, and at times I just found a little bit much. But I'd really highly recommend reading it if you kind of love that sort of slightly absurd, slightly bonkers sort of storytelling, because I think it just does some really exciting and interesting things all the way throughout. Anyhow, those are all the books I have read this week. I'd love to hear what you've been reading and your thoughts on some of those. And yeah, it's an exciting time. I will probably be here for the next video I do from this, and then eventually back home. But from Chilli, who is out on the balcony now, and me, have a wonderful week, and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.